This is Justice, History, and the Law. Lectures, discussions, and interviews from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York.
October 24, 2001, four of Jackson's fellow Nuremberg prosecutors spoke at the Jackson Center and at local schools and colleges. James Conway, Henry King, Bernie Meltzer, and Whitney Harris participated. This symposium was more than history revisited. It demonstrated that the Nuremberg principles remain relevant to the 21st century.
Welcome. My name is Greg Peterson. I am the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and I'm thrilled that today is an extraordinary event in collaboration with Jamestown Community College and the folks at Olean High School. We're going to have an extraordinary presentation by Henry King. Quick biography on Robert H. Jackson. He was born in Spring Creek Township, Warren County, Pennsylvania in 1892. At age 5, he moved to Frewsburg, New York, and there he graduated from high school, did a postgraduate year at Jamestown High School in 1910. Thereafter, never went to college. Spent 1 year at Albany Law School where he crammed down 2 years' worth of work in one. Came back, read for the law, passed the law at the earliest time possible, age 21. Practiced law in Jamestown for 20 years, representing a variety of clients. Being a good lawyer and being a good Democrat, his ties became closely intertwined with Franklin Roosevelt. As a result, he rose in the ranks to New York State, and ultimately when Franklin Roosevelt became President Franklin Roosevelt, he found his way to Washington, working for what is now known as the Internal Revenue Service. He became a Solicitor General, Assistant Attorney General, Attorney General. In 1941, he became a Supreme Court Justice, and in 1945 was appointed by President Harry Truman to be the lead counsel at the International Military Tribunal. We also know him as the Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg Trials. He referred to that particular event at Nuremberg as time spent which was the most important, enduring, and constructive work of his life. We are thrilled today to have one of those prosecutors who was with Robert Jackson. Henry King, graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, is the United States Director of the Canada-United States Law Institute, a professor at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and counsel to the law firm of Squire, Sanders, and Dempsey. Mr. King, as I mentioned, former U.S. prosecutor at the Nuremberg Trials, is the author of a book on Nuremberg, defendant Albert Speer, called The Two Worlds of Albert Speer, which we have, and I got to tell you, there's only 5 copies, I believe, left. They're out in the front. There are no others. So if you're waiting to buy them some other time, don't wait. They're here, and maybe Henry, I'll be your agent, and we'll have a chance to autograph those later on. In addition, for those, the Jamestown Community College was gracious enough to get some additional copies of Tyranny on Trial. This is a compilation of work authored by Whitney Harris, who will be joining us tomorrow at the Robert Jackson Center at 10:30 a.m. For those who are not only here are welcome to come, the public is welcome to come to a roundtable discussion, which will be occurring at that time, of which Henry King will be participating. Henry King's resume is long. He is actively involved in a variety of subjects. He's served as a member of the ABA Task Force on War Crimes in the former Yugoslavia. He's published more than 70 articles on legal subjects, including international business transactions, international arbitration, and Nuremberg-related topics. I had a chance to spend some time with Professor King last night, and I think you're going to really enjoy his talk. At this point, I'd like to introduce Henry King.
So I decided to be a big fish in a small puddle instead of a little tiny fish in a big puddle. And I secured a big job with a small firm. And I invited Ted Fenstermacher, who's from Cortland, my classmate at Yale, to tell him about it, what I had done, this great victory I had. And my wife cooked a very good roast pork dinner. She didn't like to cook, but she did cook on occasion. And sometimes as you go through life, the telling of an experience is greater than the doing. So this was a crow job, to crow about the victory I had succeeded in achieving. Well, the net result was, after I made my announcement, Ted said, well, I hate to upstage you, but I'm joining the U.S. prosecution staff at Nuremberg. Well, my wife wouldn't let me get to bed that night. The following day, I was on the steps of the Pentagon, and it wasn't long thereafter that I was sailing past the Statue of Liberty en route to Nuremberg. Now, I arrived at Nuremberg about 4:30 in the morning in March 1946 in a blinding rainstorm. And so I trudged over through the Bahnhof to the Grand Hotel, and I went to the Grand Hotel. I spent about 2 hours, and the following day I walked to the courthouse. It seemed as though civilization had vanished in Nuremberg. It had been hit by a March 2nd to 3rd British raid, and there was nobody around. People were living in cellars. You couldn't find anybody. And it seemed as though civilization had vanished, where there had been great culture. Viet Stas, the famous wood carver, Hans Sachs, the shoemaker poet, the great artist, and the Meistersinger, the original Meistersinger in Nuremberg. As I walked to the courthouse, I got a sense of mission that this couldn't happen again. I was not going to let it. Up to now, I'd been pushed by my wife. She had a needle in my rear end to get on the ship to Nuremberg. But after that, I was my own propulsion. Well, let's back up again a bit and deal with the major issues and Jackson's participation in it. After World War II, you had 56,500,000 killed in World War II, more than all the wars in history put together. And so the question came up, what do you do with the major Nazi war criminals? Joe Stalin said, take 50,000 out and shoot them, the top guys. Winston Churchill favored summary execution. Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, same thing. Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of Treasury, same thing. But there was a voice of restraint that was exercised, and that was Henry L. Stimson, the Secretary of War. He wanted a trial to determine guilt. And he talked Roosevelt into that position. But Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, at Warm Springs, Georgia. But on April 13, 1945, Robert Jackson, then Justice Jackson, the Supreme Court, gave a speech before the American Society of International Law in which he said there should be a fair trial. He wanted no part of a drumhead court-martial. He wanted a trial based on the evidence. If you were guilty on the basis of the evidence, you paid the penalty. But if you weren't, you were released from custody. So this attracted the attention of President Harry Truman through his assistant, Justice Rosenman. And on May 2nd, 1945, Jackson was appointed the U.S. representative in the determination with the Allies as to what to do with the major German war criminals. And on June 6, 1945, Jackson delivered a report, which is the blueprint for not only Nuremberg, but also the trials that are taking place in the Hague involving criminals in former Yugoslavia, and the trials that are taking place in Tanzania for Uganda crimes. So it's this blueprint that Jackson delivered to President Truman on June 6, which made him the architect of Nuremberg. Now, Jackson felt that the primary problem in the world was crimes against peace. Crimes against peace of the world, aggressive war, violations of treaty. So that was the first set of crimes. He felt they were fundamental crimes. That was Hitler's invasion of Poland, the Saddam Hussein invasion of Kuwait. The second set of crimes were war crimes, crimes against the laws of war, crimes in violation of the Hague and Geneva Conventions. These are the crimes violating the rules of how you conduct warfare against civilians and prisoners of war. For example, the use of prisoners of war in armaments industries used to produce armaments against their native country would be a violation of these rules. The third set of crimes were crimes against humanity, massive crimes against individuals for racial, religious, or political reason. And these are crimes, in a sense, against all humanity. Massive crimes like the final solution involving the proposed extermination of the Jewish race from the face of the earth. Also, Jackson wanted accountability at all levels. Accountability at the highest level, no sovereign immunity. He wanted no superior orders defense, because in the Third Reich, most orders were issued under Hitler's name, so that would be a perfect out for people. He also didn't want national laws, such as the national law of Nazi Germany, to be an excuse in connection with crimes against humanity. What Jackson saw was a world where individuals had rights which are not only national in scope, but international scope. International human rights, international duties. Again, the thesis, human accountability. He took this to negotiations in London and negotiated with the Russians and also the British and the French. The Russians wanted a presumption of guilt. Jackson wanted presumption of innocence. Jackson prevailed. Russians wanted the crime of war, crimes against peace limited only to what the Nazis did. Jackson wanted a general prohibition on crimes against peace. Jackson prevailed, and prevailed on every individual concept involved in Nuremberg. So Nuremberg is Jackson's blueprint for a better world. Now, on where to hold the trial, Russians said Berlin. Jackson, Nuremberg. Nuremberg was the situs of the Nazi laws against Jews. It was the situs of the great party rallies. It was also a situs of a party headquarters. So that this was an arrangement where Jackson determined the situs of the trials. The big courthouse and the prison adjourning attracted Jackson also. On the selection of defendants, Jackson decided that each defendant might be the top person in each walk of German life. Diplomats, military, industrialists. This is the way the defendants were selected. Now, in connection with the presentation of the case, Jackson favored a documentary case. Let the Nazis convict themselves with their own words, not by testimony that could be attacked. And this was the basic thesis, the approach that was adopted. However, they did have several witnesses who were very significant. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, was a witness. And he testified on April 9, 1946, that while he was commandant of Auschwitz, 2,500,000 people were exterminated. Another 500,000 people died of illness at Auschwitz. Otto Ohlendorf, who was the head of the action group in southern Russia, looked like a banker, industrialist. An appearance in the courtroom, he said that while he was head of Einsatzgruppe D in southern Russia, that 90,000 men, women, and children were exterminated. That's the type of witness we had. I don't want to go into the details of the trial. That's another story. But we had two primary defendants. One was Hermann Goering, who was the deputy for, who was the number 2 man in the Third Reich, at least officially. But then Albert Speer, who was actually number 2 in power at the end. Now, as a result of Nuremberg, 3 individuals were acquitted, which gives Nuremberg credibility. 7 people got jail sentences, 12 were sentenced to hang. And the United Nations on December 11, 1946, adopted the Nuremberg Principles as part of international law. But there was a hiatus there because the Cold War was on. Neither Russia nor the United States, who were the powerful countries in the world, wanted to engage in any extension of Nuremberg. Both felt that they might be victims of a new era of war crimes trials. Now, the Cold War ended in late 1980s and 1990. In 1993 and 1994, Security Council resolutions established war crimes trials in the former Yugoslavia and in Tanzania for crimes committed in Rwanda. The Yugoslav crimes were tried at The Hague. The Rwanda crimes were tried in Rwanda. Now, these adopted Jackson's approach at Nuremberg. Fundamental crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, all what Jackson had outlined at Nuremberg. No crime of aggression because it was felt allegedly that was not applicable. Now, these trials are being conducted today. The climax of the trial will be the trial of Slobodan Milosevic at The Hague for crimes of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity committed in the former Yugoslavia. Now, these are different from Nuremberg in some senses. At The Hague, involving Yugoslavia, no hanging. Life sentences maximum. That was the European approach. There are appeals possible in The Hague, not possible at Nuremberg. Also, at The Hague, one of the points to keep in mind was that an individual could be tried in absentia. Not true at I mentioned Nuremberg. An individual could be tried in absentia at Nuremberg. However, at The Hague, the individual who's a defendant has the right to confront his excusers. So there are differences, but this is a monument to Jackson's vision. However, this trial, these concepts are ad hoc. These trials are limited in time and location. They die when they run out of defendants to try. So there was a need for an American International Criminal Court. And so at the conference in Rome for an International Criminal Court, the nations of the world, with the primary exception of the United States, adopted a statute for a permanent International Criminal Court. One of the things about a criminal court visualized in terms of looking ahead is that this would set forth the crimes that people could anticipate were violative of international law, and their punishment. It's a permanent institution. It'll be the most important new institution of the 21st century. It adopts Jackson's concepts on crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and the former Nuremberg prosecutors, including Whitney Harris and myself and one other, were instrumental in getting aggression included in the statute, but only subject to its subsequent jurisdiction. What does this mean for the international landscape? It means that if you have an Osama bin Laden and he commits crimes after this statute for a criminal court goes into effect, he could be tried at The Hague for violation of those laws. The important thing is it should act as a deterrent for future breakers of international law. Also, one feature that's very important is that if the nation involved tries its own, then the international court has no jurisdiction. That's a very important point. Another point that's very important is that the Security Council of the UN can delay for 6 months the trial of an individual, and that 6 months can be extended. Why did the United States want to turn its back on Jackson? Well, the fear that American soldiers would be subject to the same rules that everybody else in the world is. I maintain that the protections of American soldiers are very great. If you try them yourself, no jurisdiction for the criminal court. Also, the U.S. is a member permanently of the Security Council, could delay the trial on a 6-month basis, which can be extended. It's shameful that the United States is not part of this activity. 42 countries of the 60 necessary have agreed to ratify this treaty. Nations of the world, including the European nations, Australia, Canada, all our friends are party to it. German parliament ratified it 351 to nothing. So the U.S. is on the outside looking in. We've got to get in the inside and participate in this activity. I don't think the Pentagon should determine our policy on building a better world under a rule of law. So to sum up, what's this all about? Well, Jackson's vision was that reason should replace power as a government determinant of relations between nations and individuals globally. He said that Nuremberg is the greatest tribute in his opening statement, that power had ever paid to reason. Second point is that the complaining party, according to Jackson in his opening statement at Nuremberg, is civilization. That we had to get a handle on relations between nations. Otherwise, with the destruction of new technology, we destroy ourselves from the face of the earth. That this was important because civilization should rise up and be a party to the biggest trial in history. This is right in Jackson's opening statement. Another, also important, particularly relevant for the United States, is the statement in his opening statement that to pass a poisoned chalice to the lips of these defendants, we pass it to our lips as well. That we have to be governed by international law and international rules. Well, Jackson didn't see the implementation of his dream in his lifetime, but it's very with us today. It's the basic framework on which most nations visualize the world of the future. Jackson had his critics. Supreme Court Justice Harlan Sloan, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said that Nuremberg was a high-class lynching expedition. Some statement by a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Robert Taft said that Nuremberg was a travesty on the rule of law. He was disparaged by Douglas. He was disparaged everybody. But he had the courage of his conviction. He knew in his heart that he was right. He knew it from within him. I leave you with several thoughts today. One, if it's said that Robert Jackson was a dreamer, I say amen. We need dreamers. We need visionaries. We need people who can look outside our framework, see a better world out there where individuals and nations can relate to one another on a rule of law. It's the rule of law that made America great. Why can't we apply it internationally? This is what it's all about. I say also that you have to dream because the world is imperfect. The Jackson's vision is the right one for us because the power of technology in small countries is immense. We see it today with the destruction of the World Trade Center and individuals. We have to have rules that govern our relationship across borders. I believe also personally that we have to keep our eyes on the stars. We have to look over the hill with vision to see a better world. And we have to tithe a bit to secure that better world. People should be involved in the push for U.S. accession to the International Criminal Court. We don't sit on the sidelines because we can't afford it. I don't think we can afford it. Sure, Jackson was a dreamer. And some dreams fade under the glare of practicality. Other dreams become outmoded by time. But there are dreams such as Jackson's, which become the new reality in a world transformed. I think the greatest danger we face is not to dream at all. Thank you.
I know Professor King has graciously permitted questions and any answers, provide answers to any questions everybody has here from the audience. Also, if there are any questions from our folks in Olean, I'd be more than happy to entertain those at this time. However, I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your book. We're going to plug that book.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. If you want to talk a little bit about Albert Speer, one of the more unique individuals who were one of the 21 defendants.
Yeah, right. So first we'll ask if anybody has any questions, then yes, sir.
Where does the opposition come from in the United States to ratification of the treaty?
Pentagon. Pentagon is against it. And other countries have been threatened with the withdrawal of support if they ratify it. But that's unconfirmed. That's what the Pentagon's supposed to. Yeah.
Do you care to comment on the so-called American Services Protection Act?
Yeah, I think that's most unfortunate because that's the means that Jesse Helms is using to frustrate the achievement of what we believe in. It's a means of cutting off aid to countries which support the treaty. I don't think that if there are other law-abiding countries which want to support the treaty, we should threaten them or punish them. And this is what is being done by the American Service Protection Act. And also with during the negotiations, there were reports that we're threatened with other countries if they supported the treaty. The fact is that the world is going with the treaty. I don't like the fact that the U.S. is not part of the world in terms of relations between nations. The law of the sea treaty is the law today, but the U.S. is not part of that treaty. It covers 70% of the Earth's surface. And you have fish out on the shores of the United States because of the law of the sea treaty, because other people have agreed to it. I don't like disparaging this country, but I think that we have to be part of these new developments. And I think that the rule of law is coming in the world. I think it's important that we participate and shape it. Yeah.
Isn't it already true that when we have troops stationed, for example, in Japan, they come under Japanese law, criminal law, don't they? Because you periodically hear about that. So what's the big difference between that and something like
No difference, yeah. The important thing is their status of forces agreements between the United States and other countries where troops are, which determine whether they're tried by local courts or in other cases by U.S. military court. We've already conceded a lot of that. So it's very important that we be part of the world. And I think we have to implement Jackson's vision. I think it's quite an honor to be here today, to be celebrating an individual who changed the face of the world for the better. There are plenty of Hitlers and all that, but we've got to honor the good guys. And there's a good guy here. And he had courage, and he took the slings and arrows of his countrymen. Justice Stone wouldn't even swear in Biddle as a justice on the Nuremberg court. And when I came back because of what Taft had said, I had trouble getting a job. Disparaged by some of the bar people. The American Bar has turned around now. American Bar Association endorsed what the whole concept of an international criminal court. They endorsed what Jackson did at Nuremberg. So the important thing is we've got a choice. Do we want to turn our back on the future? Do we want to look backwards, where there was anarchy ruling between nations? Or do we want to look ahead and use the distinguishing characteristics that makes men and women different from our animal friends? Reason. Reason achieved the high ground at Nuremberg. And we've got to keep to that high ground. Yeah.
You mentioned that 3 individuals were acquitted and 7 received prison sentences.
Yeah.
Were there sentencing guidelines agreed on ahead of time before the trial started?
No. No sentencing guidelines, but when you didn't agree, it meant that hanging was possible. The reason that hanging, the Europeans don't favor hanging, but there was a pent-up emotion against the defendants who'd been responsible for the killing of 56,500,000 people. So it's very important. That's an important difference with the current tribunal, where if Milosevic is guilty, then he gets a life sentence if the crimes are that much. And also, there was kick about there's no appeal at Nuremberg. Now they have appeals, and the criminal court has appeals. Yes, sir.
How was it that Jackson was able to prevail on all the issues at Nuremberg over the Russians and everyone else?
Have you ever heard of the word courage?
Yes.
Courage. It's the sense that what you're doing is right and meaningful. It takes courage because he took the slings and arrows from everybody. The Russians, the English, they didn't want to go with the Churchill wanted a summary execution. So courage is not definable really. It's only recognized by people who have it. It's the courage of vision. It's the courage of able to think out the firmament in which you are and have a vision of a better world. Think beyond your surroundings. So that's what made Jackson's greatest job.
What was Jackson's greatest attribute as a person?
Well, okay, this is good. He was the greatest wordsmith we ever produced in the legal profession. The magic of words. The complaining party at your bar is civilization. Pretty good words. Isn't that so? This trial is the most significant tribute that power has ever paid to reason. As we place a poison chalice to our lips, to the lips of these defendants, we place it to our lips as well. The world recognizes these phrases. These are immortal. 1,000 years from now, people will recognize Jackson for what he did. Nobody like him. That's what made him unique. Courage, his ability to capsulize in a few sentences world. His speech, his sentences speak worlds. We don't have that eloquence today. We don't have anybody who knows how to talk like that or write like that. He came from here.
You're doing pretty well. I said, you're doing pretty well.
Well, he's an inspiration to me. You probably won't hear another one like me. But I really, you probably won't because I'm committed. And I believe in this. And I'm here today because my heart is in it. You can intellectualize on international law to eternity. You can write good rules and all that. But it's conviction. It's the heart. I'm speaking with my heart today. That's very important. Do people do that anymore? When I saw in Nuremberg, a city that had been destroyed, was the crossroads of civilization for 400 years before. And there's nothing there. I saw the massive power of technology, which has no inbred ethics. Be good for mankind, be bad. But we have to learn how to relate to one another so that we don't destroy ourselves. You see what I mean? Yeah.
What was the alternative that Justice Stone had, or Taft had, or Helms had?
Well, he said that he would execute certain Nazis because they're bad guys.
Without trial.
Right. And, I look at the people around here. I don't know. Are there bad guys here? I mean, this is what, can you imagine the parody of the Chief Justice of the United States saying we execute people because they're bad? It's honorable that Nuremberg acquitted 3 defendants. That's very honorable. They didn't have the evidence. It proves the credibility of Nuremberg. We didn't convict Schacht, we didn't convict Van Papen or Switchen. That's very important. And so that's what courts and trials are all about. That's what Jackson said in his American Society of International Law speech, that you don't want to hang people without documentation, without proof that they did something. Now, one of the things is that that's what makes the U.S. different in our legal systems from many other countries in the world. There's a presumption of innocence, not of guilt. And we don't convict people on a drum court-martial basis. John?
Yeah, I have a question about politics.
Yeah.
It strikes me that your dad was an elected official. I don't know if you've ever run, but I don't think you ever were in elected office.
That's the one regret I never had.
Well, and Robert Jackson never ran. And for all the power of his intellect and the beauty of his words, maybe we'd be further along if he'd run for governor and then become president, rather than devote a life to litigation and then appointive office and judicial office. What do you think about law versus politics as the path on which one should choose to fight?
Well, the problem is, I based my experience on my father's. One of the problems is that politics sometimes favors expediency, and the law is the law. I think Roosevelt said that he thought Jackson would make a good candidate for president, as you know. But his vision was to be Chief Justice of the United States. It was not to be president. But maybe it's important we persuade people who have vision to run for office. The problem is the economics. I don't know whether Jackson was wealthy, I doubt it. It takes a lot of money to run for office. I wanted to run for Congress, and I said, well, where are you going to get the money? And so that ended that discussion. But I remember people, I remember one close friend of mine inherited $125,000, and he ran against Congressman Walter in Pennsylvania, who was a perennial, and he lost by about 1,000 votes, but he was out of his 125,000, so he had to go back to Washington with his tail between his legs. It's hard to run for office because of the money deal, and what you have to do. Yeah, sure.
Tell us what you thought of Albert Speer, if you would.
Well, okay. I interrogated the defendants like Scott, Sappho, Gehrig. I prepared the case against Erhard Milch, who was the head of the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. He was on the cover of Time magazine in August 1940, August 26th. So Milch was accused of slave labor. In that activity, Speer had been his cohort. So I wanted to get one Nazi to talk against the other, which is what our standard practice. So I get with Speer, and about 1 minute into the conversation, I became convinced I got a dry hole because he wouldn't say anything against Milch, who had intervened in Speer's behalf with Hitler at the end of, in the spring of '44, after Speer's illness. So I'm sitting there, I've got the top Nazi, and what are we talking about? Well, he was drawing a picture of a woman against the sky. She's a woman with a black hood over her head, kerchief, and she's looking off into the sky. The sky is very dark, and the bench is there. And I said, hey, Speer, what are you drawing? I said, well, who is it? He says, it's my mother. I said, it's a very gloomy picture. Why is she so gloomy? She says, she's gloomy because I'm here. So I said to him, well, you're quite an artist. And so I said, my mother's an artist, and my mother-in-law. And so we began to ease up and start talking art and what it was like to be an architect for Hitler. And I said, well, what was Hitler like? Well, he said he was a mesmerizer. He said, how did you influence Hitler? Well, he said, I pre-dialogue my conversations. Every Wednesday night, I took the night plane from Tempelhof Airdrome in Berlin to the Ober-Salzburg. And what I did was pre-rehearsed. What's Hitler going to say? What I'm going to say. And when I said, what do you mean? I said, how would you do that? He says, you couldn't manipulate Hitler. Well, he said, I'll give you an example. He said, Foreman, who was my rival, head of the party, proposed that all the industrial installations in the Low Countries and in France be destroyed because we were retreating. So On the way down, is that he had an actual order, proposed order in his hands. I said, now how am I going to deal with Hitler? Well, he said, I got to deal with the Fuhrer's ego. So I get to the Ober Salzburg, I pick the order up, I go into Hitler's headquarters, and I said, hey, mein Führer, Herr Foreman has proposed that we destroy all the industrial installations in the Low Countries and in France. And this meant Renault works in France, Philips Goldlamp works in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. He said, you don't want to do that. We're coming back. Mein Führer, you said we were coming back. We're going to need those installations. And Hitler ripped up the order. That's a true, So he knew how to. Now, one of the things was that Frau Jungby, who was Hitler's secretary, told me that Hitler felt he had no friends with one exception. And he told her repeatedly, the only friend I have is Albert Speer. She said that when she sat up with anyone there, that she heard Hitler and Speer fighting like cats and dogs. And he said he was the only one who would tackle Hitler. He said, for instance, Manstein, who was a great German general in Eastern Europe, one of the greatest of all time generals, would stand out in the hour room, I'm going to tell the Fuhrer this and this and that. He'd come out with his tail between his legs. Mein Fuhrer was right, I was wrong. But he said Speer went in and he would fight with him. And Speer told me that sometimes he didn't know whether he was going to get out alive. That he would felt like the loneliest man in the world, where after a fight with Hitler, Speer would call his deputy Sauer and start dealing with him. Because Hitler maintained his power by playing one individual off against the other. In other words, Foreman versus Speer. These were the two top ones under Hitler. Foreman and Speer were number two. Speer was, according to Zeisler, who was the commander, the chief of staff of the German army, Hitler had told Zeisler that he favored Speer as his successor. The minute Foreman got hold of that information, then he started undermining Speer. Göring was played off against Speer. Goebbels against von Ribbentrop. Keitel versus Himmler. So this was a make. And Frau Jungby told me that Hitler compartmentalized everybody, that nobody knew what the other guy was doing. So that's how he maintained his power. Yes, sir.
Is it true that Speer was saved from death because he was the honest guy there, that he basically came clean, and that the judges felt that he didn't deserve the death penalty?
Well, what happened, that's a good question. Okay, on the vote on Speer. First of all, Russian judge hanged, U.S. judge hanged, British judge 20 years, French judge 15 years. American judge Bill stays up all night and rethinks the whole thing. And he changed his mind and went for the British judge. The main thing that saved Speer was his acknowledgement that he was guilty of, he shared the guilt after he took over as war production minister on February 9, 1942. He was responsible with Hitler for what had been done. And he was the only one who did that. So I think that motivated Biddle to change his mind. Also, if it's not meaningful and it doesn't enable us to progress to a rule of law, then technology will destroy us. Rockets moving with the speed of sound, according to Speer, would destroy New York City. His closing statement foreshadows a lot of what happened on September 11th. Basically, the statement that unless we get a handle on technology, then we have to worry about our future. That he told me personally that technology has no built-in ethic. We have to see whether change works for us. So you could say his closing statement foreshadowed what has happened. And Biddle, in his book on brief authority, published in 1964, quoted all Speer's closing statement and his summation of his book. So it was Speer's influence over Biddle, the American judge, that changed the face of history. So in a way, he saved himself. Now, Hans Flaxner, who was Speer's attorney, told me at the Borough in Hilton on September 15, 1964, that he told Speer he was committing suicide if he pleaded guilty, if he pleaded responsible. You can't do it. You can't do it. And Speer said, well, I'm the boss of my own destiny. I want to do it. And so it was, I don't think it was a premeditated deal to try and save his soul. Because what Flaxner's argument was, if you plead responsible, what are you going to do with everybody else? Now, the reason they saved Speer was mitigation. That he went into the bunker at the end of the World War, where Hitler had given the order for the destruction of Germany. Speer countermanded that order and went to the Gauleiters all over Europe. And also that he favored the Black Industries program in France, where slave workers could work in France and not be deported to Germany. Those two considerations. The important thing here is that the French judge voted for 15 years. So he persuaded people. So they found him guilty. He did bad things. He was one of the bad lot. But there were two elements of mitigation. And I thought it was a fair decision. I didn't. Otherwise, we'd have no history. We have Inside the Third Reich, which is an all-time world bestseller because of Speer, what he wrote. And told the inside of what it was like to deal with it. So he's a historian as well as a war criminal, and we know how Hitler manipulated things to maintain his power. It's the only record we have that has any authenticity of somebody who's inside the Third Reich. And this, of course, is the only book that's been written by somebody who dealt with Speer over 36 years by a prosecutor. In other words, my book on Speer is the only one of its kind. But the thesis of the book is that Speer was blinded by ambition, that was vertical ambition, straight up and down, no horizontal responsibility towards society, and that's the first world, the world of the eminent specialist doing Hitler's bidding. At the same time, when the throes of German defeat, he discovers himself inside, countermands Hitler's order for the destruction of Germany, goes into the bunker on April 26, 1945, tells Hitler what he's done. Hitler said, well, if you're not my architect, I will take the action. Call for him under the circumstance. And then at Nuremberg is the only defendant said, well, I'm responsible. So the second world is the world of the questioning spirit, where you question everything. You ask yourself the right questions. The first world is the vertical world with no critical thinking. The second world is the world of critical thinking. Is this right? Not only for myself, but for society. Yeah.
How do you evaluate Judge Biddle's role, his performance at that trial? He really did the right things.
Well, the thing about Biddle was that he was mad because he wasn't named Chief Justice, because Jackson told him he couldn't be Chief Justice, otherwise it would be all an American show. And I think Biddle sort of prodded Chief Justice Lawrence into letting hearing ran on. So his role was not constructive from that standpoint, but from the standpoint of himself, he played a major role in the writing of the verdict. I mean, and I think it's a magnificent judgment. But there were Jackson and Biddle had conflicting ambitions. great people, but sometimes they both want to be they both have ambitions that soar, and sometimes the soaring ambitions conflict. So I'd read his book. Brief Authority is a great book. It's really worth reading. Yeah.
After the fall of apartheid, South Africa set up committees where people that participated in terrorist action against the black population were allowed to testify fully, get the truth out, and then they were allowed to go free. Do you have any feelings about that type of?
Yeah, that was okay in South Africa where the two races needed each other. I've been asked that, I was asked that, hammered on that one at Freiburg Law School. That's the top law school where I delivered a lecture in Germany. The problem is that that's nice for the people involved. It's a special case. It's not a case where you had people who had destroyed a whole civilization. And the world was not ready for that approach at that time. We had to do something. Nuremberg showed great restraint on the part of the Allies. That's fair alternative, but in that such particular situation, because they'd have destroyed each other.
I'd like to thank Henry King for an extraordinary hour we had with him.
The Jackson Center is a historical and educational facility dedicated to preserving the legacy of this country lawyer who became Solicitor General, Attorney General, a Justice of the Supreme Court, and served as Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg Trials of Nazi war criminals following World War II. To learn more about this program, Robert Jackson, the Jackson Center, and upcoming events, the Jackson Center is located at 305 East 4th Street, Jamestown, New York, and found on the web at www.roberthjackson.org or contacted by telephoning 716-483-6646.